Welcome to the Commercial Awareness Compass. I'm your host today, Tori. I'm a trainee solicitor, and this is your weekly guide to developing your commercial insight. So this is going beyond just the news. We're going to take you through the 3 levels of commercial awareness. So moving from a basic understanding to intermediate to advanced. So whether you're brand new to commercial awareness or your understanding is already kind of at a later stage, the goal here is for you to move through each level, 1 level per week. We're joined today by Emma Lilly, who's an in-house lawyer with extensive experience in commercial law. Emma brings expert insight into how commercial issues impact businesses and the role that firms play in helping clients navigate these challenges. So welcome, Emma. Thank you so much for being here with us. Today, we're going to be working our way through a news story about Ed Sheeran and intellectual property. So could you please just summarize the story for us? What's going on here?
Of course I can. Thanks, Tori. So yeah, this week we are looking at the news around Ed Sheeran and Band-Aid. So Ed Sheeran has stated that he did not give permission for the use of his vocals on the new Band-Aid song. This is relevant in many more ways that you may realise, as we will get on throughout this session today, as Tori has implied. But it's going to have an impact on how businesses might deal with IP in the media space, deal with commercial elements. There's this charity point to this as well, but it's all thinking about permissions moving forward, and I can't wait to get stuck into it with you today.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So we're at the beginner stage. So the idea at this stage of commercial awareness is that it's really kind of these basics of how to understand what's going on in the story and why does it matter. So could you talk a little bit about how this story is relevant to commercial awareness?
Of course I can, because you might think, well, Ed Sheeran, media, we're talking about like a pop culture-y sort of thing. How can this be relevant to commercial awareness? How can I use it in interviews? How is it going to enhance my skill here? But that's the whole point. It's knowing what's underlying between the story itself and how we relate that to law and bring it into the commercial sense. So as I've hinted just a few seconds ago, there's lots of different areas of law that this touches upon and lots of different other aspects for businesses and law firms too. You might not have thought that permission in the own right of the title of all of these articles implies some sort of dispute. It implies rights. It's about breaking these basic words down and bringing them into the realm of law and what might be coming or what might have already happened. This is a pretty huge public statement to make. You know, it's on his Instagram. He's got millions of followers. It's reached the mainstream media. And although those articles aren't too long, I am confident that there would have been some legal advice that's gone into it or that may come out of that. So it absolutely is relevant. Just to give another little hint before we move on to the intermediate stage, some of those things might be litigation. It might potentially become litigious. I've already mentioned a dispute. We've got IP rights. Who would have known that somebody could have intellectual property rights in their vocals? But hey, we're talking about that here today. Perhaps defamation, who knows? Don't come at me for mentioning that. I'm not making any sort of legal statement, especially in the realm of defamation. If you're not sure what that is, don't worry, we will get onto that in a little moment. But just a few things there to mention, Tori, to introduce this beginner's aspect.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much. I've been writing down some of these keywords that you've been using because I wonder if maybe some of our listeners aren't aware of what these mean. So I just wanted to take us through a few of these. So the first word that you used was litigious. Could you explain a little bit about what that means?
Of course I can. So litigious comes from, I would say, litigation. And litigation comes from essentially people having a bit of a tiff in court. So people not agreeing with things, taking it outside of a conversation that might be a legal conversation, but it's a conversation all the same, into court. So when something becomes litigious, litigation is invoked, and there's usually some sort of court dispute that would happen from there.
Thanks. And I think the other term that could be helpful for our listeners or viewers to understand is just intellectual property. I use that phrase, you use that phrase. So what is intellectual property?
Of course, and excuse me for abbreviating that to IP. I think it's easier to use IP from here on. But IP is essentially rights that somebody might hold in certain creative work. So there's a few different categories of IP. You may have heard about copyright in a loose sense, trademark, even patents or patents. There might be some dispute around which way we pronounce that word. But essentially, these are where there's a creative work that's protected in some way by the law in terms of any commercial gain of that. Usually it's commercial gain. Copyright, think creative. Trademark, think logos, things like that. And patents, think more like inventions. There's more to each of those things, but in terms of the basics of IP, I think that should do it for now.
Okay, thanks so much. So at our beginner level, then we have this understanding we're dealing with IP. There's potentially some disputes that could occur, and we're dealing with this very public statement on Instagram.
Absolutely.
So if we have this grasp of the basics down, then could you explain, and I think maybe we're moving a bit into intermediate now, but could you explain how this specifically impacts companies, or why companies, or why Ed Sheeran or Band-Aid, why they would need legal advice?
Of course I can, and it's a great question. That's the part of the intermediate stage that we're getting into, isn't it? How do we link this to a legal advisor and what might come out of this or may have already happened? So if you think when somebody of such commercial stature as Ed Sheeran, of course he's a human, but he's also a commercial entity in his own right, something to maybe get your head around at this stage as well. Ed Sheeran is not only a human like the rest of us, but he's also a walking commercial entity. He has money that is made out of his brand, his name, and in this case, his vocals. So when we put it that way, there's also an opportunity to exploit those sort of things and an opportunity to want to defend your commercial brand in that sense. So Ed may or may not have already taken legal advice on such a public statement, because if he's going to put something out there so widely and so publicly, there's an impact on his commercial entity. It's his brand. And looking into this a little bit more, he doesn't use Instagram too much. He's not a big social media guy. So this is what kind of made this interesting to me. It seems more of I'm going to post my view on Instagram. It seems like a business stance to me. You know how social media is being used more and more for influencing. People can make a lot of money through it. And it's a way of expressing your brand, but it's a commercial way of expressing his brand in this way. So to make a statement like this, I would be very surprised if he didn't take some sort of advice on it beforehand. And a lot of celebrities or people with big followings would do this anyway, or at least he has now since taken advice because of the impact that it might have. There's this mention of permission. If I would have been asked, then I would have politely declined. Making a statement like that to me is way more than just a personal opinion. It's a business position to put forward. So as soon as I think business position, you think, well, advice, legal advice, is there any legal implication? Secondly, where we lead from that is the dispute elements that we've already introduced and the potential litigation, right? If permission is mentioned, think rights, think that somebody owns something and they've not given permission to give that away. What rights does Ed believe that he has in that means those have either been exploited, or he should have got some sort of commercial gain for that, or, as he has alluded to, it's a moral reason as to why he's not gone there. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail perhaps shortly. But those, I think, is what kind of goes into my mind in terms of legal advice and what might be needed, Tori.
Okay, that's really helpful. I found it especially useful, your explanation of an artist as also being a commercial entity. I think that that's really useful from a commercial awareness perspective, to see that kind of the business that is operating right now, that it's not just an individual. This is an individual who also has this huge brand. So I think that's really interesting and really useful. At this intermediate stage, really what we're looking at is kind of why businesses care, and then how law firms assist with these kind of events. So I think that you've outlined really well how law firms can assist. So for example, advising people on whether or not to make a statement, or how to phrase that kind of statement. Could we talk a little bit also about this why businesses care piece at this stage?
We absolutely can, because behind all of this, somewhere there are agreements that exists. There are lawyers everywhere. You can't avoid us. You really can't avoid us. And as soon as you start to embody this commercial awareness compass way of thinking, you will realize that law is everywhere. Why should businesses care? Is because there are contracts behind all of these things. So Band-Aid as an entity themselves would have, or you would expect would have, contracts or agreements in place with the vocalists of the rights that they are using on things like this. So you've got an agreement there between those people. That might work in a really complex way. It might be really simple. Who knows? We aren't privy to that, but there will be some sort of contractual agreement in place as to the permission of that. Or in Ed's case, as he is alleging, there is the absence of one. So we've not got that either. So that's why a business such as Band-Aid or a charity, if we look at that element of it as well, would care about it. Because it's so public, anyone else in the media space is going to have their eyes on this. They don't want to be in the position that Band-Aid are in now. You know, we could take it way wider than vocal rights. Any sort of statement that hits the media in this way that is tainting, essentially having a negative impact on a business, might impact how they are viewed. Our streams going to be lower if for fans of Ed Sheeran, if they thought, oh well, I don't agree with the fact that they've used his vocals. Ed, my beloved Ed, says that I'm a true fan of, says that he didn't give permission for that. I'm not going to listen to it anymore. You've got the sensitive point of charities as well. So we're talking about businesses and the impact it might have on them there, any contracts they've got in place, making sure that they are de-risking those. But also charity comes into it, which is, of course, different agreements, different area of law, different regulations around that too, as to the royalties, which is where I think we might get into the more advanced stage of the conversation.
That's really useful. I just wrote down something that you said that I think is really interesting, and I think also does kind of move us into this advanced analysis, is that you mentioned the idea of de-risking contracts. So I wondered so in the advanced stage of commercial awareness, we're thinking about kind of long-term strategic thinking, how to really, really see the big picture. So if we take this example that we're talking about and this idea of de-risking contracts, how could businesses look to do that in kind of a strategic way, thinking long-term about avoiding maybe disputes on intellectual property grounds?
Good question. And you have me thinking now, because there are lots of different things, of course, that we don't know about this, we aren't privy to, but the lawyers will be. The lawyers will have access to these contracts and will be well trained on drafting certain clauses and using certain words that go in there. Ed's vocals were used at some point, I presume, with permission by Band-Aid on previous iterations of this. The issue is that they've been reused again, which implies to me there was a contract in place at some point. What does that clause say? If that clause says the vocalist gives permission for the company to use vocals in the next Band-Aid single, that could, depending on when it was signed, you would imply that to say, well, it's the very next one that's due. If it was to say the vocalist gives the company permission to use the vocals in a future Band-Aid single, is that implying that it could be used for more than one? When does that happen? So as I would see this now, businesses should be looking at their contracts and looking at the wording of the clauses. Law firms might be looking at their templates, looking at customer base that they've got in this space and saying, hey, make sure that you're aware of this. Is there anything we can do to help you to make sure that you've de-risked these contracts in this way? Have you absolutely got permission before you go out so public with something that somebody, whether it's partly the charity, 100% charity, or a little bit of commercial gain, I don't know, I'm presuming out of the good of our hearts that it's 100% charity for the benefit of that, then who is exploiting this? Have you got permission to do that? So there's that sense of it. But then there's also the de-risking generally of relationships. I mean, the overarching issue here is that there's a public dispute. This didn't have to be public, did it? Something's fallen down somewhere. And of course, there are lots of different things at play, like morals, and whether Ed believes in the Band-Aid mission or not, which is also being questioned. But there's also a reputational issue that, believe it or not, lawyers get involved with a lot more than you would think, because also that can be quite damaging to one's business entity, to come full circle back to the start of the conversation.
I'm really interested in that, actually, about how law firms are involved in this kind of a broader way than we would maybe expect when we're dealing with kind of reputation management or protection. Could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Of course I can. So the higher the reputation, the better the reputation of an individual or a business, the more likely it is to make money. Same as a law firm. If you think of all the different law firms that we know, they're all fighting to have the best reputation. The best reputation, the better clients, the more that they can charge fees wise. So it is a very important thing to protect. Now, of course, if reputation is diminished by somebody else, whether that's fair or not, you're going to defend that. And if your rights are exploited, you're also going to want to defend it. So this is where lawyers can come in and make sure that they can work as a mediator between the two, because we're in a great position, aren't we, as lawyers as well, to act on behalf of the business and protect that. But also we are, majority of the time, I caveat it, seeing as being reasonable in terms of we aren't going to protect something that's not worth protecting. It's got to be worth a lawyer's time, essentially, in the commercial sense. We aren't going to charge clients for something that would be unethical to do so. So we would be involved in the conversations between the two. A damage of reputation is a damage to business. There's lots of different areas of law that touches upon as well. So it's a really interesting role to have, especially if you're interested in something like this. There's a lot more commercial awareness that goes into an arrangement or a relationship with somebody as opposed to just a contract. One final thing on that. Every company, or the majority of companies, on their financial statements, and we are on advance now, so I'm just giving you a pre-warning, should have a line that values their business in terms of goodwill. So goodwill is essentially the reputation and the brand that they've built up in the market. So if somebody was to sell an asset, part of a business, or just valued for lots of different purposes, share value, the amount of market share that it has, how powerful it is in the business or in the overall industry that you've got, there'll be a line on goodwill. Essentially, that is another way of saying reputation. How good is the reputation in the market? Reputation equals money can sometimes lead to legal disputes.
Gotcha. I'm really glad that you used the word goodwill, actually, because I just learned this word probably a couple of weeks ago in my SQE prep. So it's definitely something for law students to be aware of. I was going to ask something. Oh, right. So at the advanced stage, we are trying to think long term as well. So I wondered if you had any reflections on, so we're talking about this kind of reputation management, but then in this situation, we have a person with a large following posting on a public platform, something that could potentially harm the reputation of another entity. Do you see social media creating any of these kind of longer term concerns of how people with these platforms could be making statements like this? Like, do you see any long-term trends here with social media that lawyers should be alert to?
I think it can be used as a great tool. Now you say it, it can be used as a great tool, because I'll be honest, when I read this statement, I thought it was a way of defending something that hadn't yet happened. So again, when you get to this stage and you are comfortable with commercial awareness, my compass was going crazy when I read his statement, because I was thinking he's preempting something by stating it in this way. It's almost like, this is my defense statement that I would put up in court. I said, if this does go to court, I said 2 years ago, I wasn't happy with this. There's the proof. It's a way of proving that something was believed, because of course, in court, you've got different elements of opinions, hearsay, what's believed, what's not believed. Social media can be a great tool for proof and a timestamp of saying, well, I've had this view all along. I never said it was okay. So it can be quite a clever way of doing things. But on the other hand, I think lawyers will also be needed a lot more when somebody posts something and slips up. We've all seen those stories of something that's been deleted or taken down because it shouldn't have been posted. There's been claims about things that are no longer existing or being posted just because they were shown or seen. So there's lots of different elements of social media that we could go into if we had lots more time, I guess.
Yeah, super interesting. So the idea being that social media, it can be a useful tool, but simultaneously can also create new risks that lawyers need to be advising people on or managing some situations after they have occurred via social media.
Absolutely. And if you think about the another element of commercial awareness, which is the law firm as a business, the law firm as a commercial entity, they are there to make money. Despite what people say, I want to be a lawyer to help people, these are huge commercial entities that have to make a profit to keep going and to pay the wages that we're seeing. So as a law firm, if they wanted to get ahead, they could look at their existing client base. They would know the risks of social media. They might take on clients that have this, and they might be able to preempt and give proactive advice around these things. And before you know it, they've got another bit of work in, and they're being commissioned with that business development that they are doing to get in more fees for the business. So it's all a working machine that goes around and around with these commercial gains. Of course, there's projects to be done and disputes to be solved and solutions to find. But at the end of the day, the law firm's there to make money. So if they can use things like this, their internal commercial awareness to their advantage, then I'm sure that they'll be doing that too.
Absolutely. So we have a few minutes left. So I thought perhaps it could be helpful for our viewers if you had any kind of general reflections, unless if you had anything else about this story that you wanted to add, please do. But I was also thinking it could be helpful to hear any kind of general reflections or tips that you have for our viewers about developing their commercial awareness.
There's one more thing I'd like to add. So Ed has a history of being in court. And if I was talking about this or using this as a way to increase my commercial awareness or to show that I had it and I could link it to the legal world, I would be thinking wider than just the article. We're now in the advanced stage. So it's not just about what's on the paper, what you're reading, and the legal part to it, and the law firm as a business. It's also about any history about what's happened to with the individual. If I was advising somebody on the other side of someone who's been litigious, confident in court, successful, that might go into the legal strategy as a lawyer. And that's just commercial awareness. I only know that from the news. I wasn't sat in Ed's courtroom when he was going through the other IP case that he went through. But I think it's also an added bonus if you can show your demonstration that you're only not just focusing on an individual article, it's the history of something, and it's that link and finding trends with things. So if I could also mention, well, I also know that Ed's been in court before, you could talk about that particular instance a little bit more, how it was successful. If I was acting on behalf of Ed, or if I was on the other side, how would that make you feel as a lawyer? It's that element to it as well that's interesting to add.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really, really helpful because I think it goes to what we said at the beginning about how Commercial Awareness Compass is about going beyond the news. And I think you make such a great point that part of that is looking at the overall context and looking at what events led up to what you're reading in the news today. So I think that that's really, really helpful to encourage students to look beyond just that story that you're reading. So thank you so much. I think that concludes our session. So I just want to thank our viewers for joining us today at the Commercial Awareness Compass. Remember that commercial awareness is more than staying on top of the news. It's really about understanding why events like these matter to clients and how you as a future lawyer can provide strategic value. So I hope that today's session has been useful as we've illustrated for you, moving from beginner to intermediate to advanced. And do join us next week to keep building your commercial awareness. And until then, prepare without the panic.